This is Jeremiah Riggins from Sanctuary Family Farms. I'm married to Katie Riggins, and we have two boys, Ben and Sam, who are 10 and 13 years old. When I was in school, my performance was less than stellar. What other kids were able to get done in class, I usually took home for homework. I was always amazed in school that kids said they were bored. I was never bored. When the teacher lost my attention, I was plenty entertained by my own thoughts, the eraser on my pencil, or even the birds outside the window. To make matters worse, I wasn't much of an athlete either. Growing up, I was pretty short. I was what you would call a late developer. At 16 years old, I was all of 5'5". By the time I was a senior, I was 5'10" and 145 pounds. An average height, but both of my brothers are over 6 foot tall. Needless to say, I was not an All-American athlete. The funny thing was that I didn't know I was short, just like I didn't know that I was skinny, or that my parents didn't make a whole lot of money. I did know that after every report card, I was probably going to be in trouble again, though. By now, I'm sure you are wondering how I made anything out of my life. My parents gave me 3 of the most important gifts a child can have: unconditional love, discipline, and they believed and taught me that God had a destiny for my life. Let's talk about each of these effects on a child's life. Unconditional love. This means that no matter what I did, my parents were going to love me. No matter how many times I lost my shoes, my mom would still take me to find them. Even when I drove a tractor through a family friend's truck, my dad still let me come home. It was more than that, though. They showed me that I had value and that I was loved. This wasn't a hollow love or approval. They looked for things that I did to be proud of. They also made sure I knew that all of the value in me was what God created, and what He created had value. The Bible says in Psalms 139:14, "I will praise Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are Thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well." The idea of being wonderfully made by God starts at home. If you don't hug, encourage, and tell your children that you are proud of them, they will have a much harder time believing that God or anyone else loves them. Discipline. Love is a two-sided coin. On one side, you need to unconditionally value the person. On the other side, you need to show discipline. In my opinion, the only parents who truly love their children are the ones who punish them. The Bible says in Proverbs 13:24, "Whoever spares a rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." If you want to be loved by your children more than you want them to do the right thing, then you love yourself more than your children. A good parent is willing for their children to not like them if it means that their child does the right thing. So when I ran the tractor into the truck, I got the biggest butt chewing of my life, and I had to help solve the problem. When I forgot my shoes, it usually involved me getting spankings by Mom. They taught me through their behavior that bad behavior and good behavior has consequences, but it did not define their love for me. Destiny. This one is usually a little harder for parents. Accepting that God has a destiny for your child means that you do not own your child or the plan for his life. Only God does. In our church, when a new baby is born, we have a baby dedication. We take the baby to the front of the church and we give that baby to God. God then gives the baby back to us to raise in His love, discipline, and His ways. It is my belief that as parents, we will take the baby, now grown, back to the altar and give him back to God. We are held accountable for how that child arrives at the altar. They will be responsible for their relationship and God's destiny from that point forward. How do we get them to the altar in good shape? First, read the Bible to them. Make sure that your children know, no matter how old they are, how important it is to hear God's voice. Tell them stories of Samuel, David, and Jesus, who were each doing the Father's work at a young age. We must show them that the Bible is real and meaningful in our lives. No one goes on a trip without a road map. Those who have only logic will be lost. Second, take them to church. The Bible says in Hebrews 10:25 that not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see that day approaching. At a certain age, parents lose some of the influence in a child's life. If you don't put them in contact with other Christians, they will adopt the ideas of the world. Third, stop rescuing them. Children must be encouraged to be bold. When they know something is right, don't tell them to go along to get along. Even if you are afraid for them, tell them how proud you are that they did the right thing. I pray that for all of us with children, we value the responsibility God has given us to love them unconditionally, to love them enough to discipline them, and teach them that their relationship with God comes before everything else.
So, Bear, I really enjoyed your blog about that, and I'm looking forward to the more that are coming after about parenting, child raising. So, because it struck me as I was listening to that about how you're almost talking about a systematic way of raising children. And a lot of what I experienced as a therapist for 34, 35 years was that the fact that parents wanted to say, well, you know what, you get what you get. What comes out of the womb is going to the tomb. And so you can't do anything about it. And I kind of just didn't raise you that way. So what are your thoughts about that? Can we shape and form our children?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look around. Bad parents generally have bad kids, right? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. A lot of the sayings we have come from somewhere. They don't come from just out of your head. So, for sure, I mean, I think what you're saying about having a plan with parenting is 100% the way I look at it. You have to place in your mind what your expectations are of your kids on the other end. And then you have to set about a course to get to that point. And that doesn't mean that you don't change it along the way, but you have to set out on a course. You have to have a plan.
Well, you know, when you say that, and as a parent, I've realized that I can't say, all right, Jeremiah, it's Monday, and Monday is Parent-Child Day, and you're going to do this, and I'm going to do that. You are in a live arena. Mm-hmm. You're almost like in a wrestling arena. Mm-hmm. You don't know what the next punch is going to be thrown. You don't know what it's going to do. How do you maintain that equilibrium of knowing that, okay, if they do this, it's not the end of the road. It's not like, okay, give me another one. I'm going to send this one back. How do you go, okay, this is expected? How does a parent come to the place they say, this is expected and acceptable, be tolerant, or, nah, this is not right. We've got to turn the screws down a little bit to get that behavior stopped?
Wow, yeah, I think that's a pretty tough question. I think first we start with the non-negotiables. So we start with, like, the 10 Commandments. That's generally a good place to start, right? Don't let your kid be beating up other kids. Don't, the basic kind of stuff. Start with the big stuff, and then you kind of start working down from that point, from the big stuff. And you said something before, actually you said something before we started. You said discipline is teaching your kids discipline. And so sometimes I think, yes, we need to look at specific behaviors that we want from our kids, but really what we're teaching our kids is how to be disciplined people. How to, you may want to do this or you may want to do that, but that's not acceptable behavior. And I think some of our norms are kind of culturally based. You always taught us to eat with manners at the table, but those manners were largely derived from the culture we came from. There was no, I would say, God truth to eating properly.
Oh, yeah, they were. Yeah, my dad had said, you don't eat this, you're going to hell.
Right,
so.
right. But what it did teach us is when you had to be disciplined, there was a time to be disciplined and a time to act a certain way, and that ability to kind of rein in. And I think ranking right up there with overall intelligence, discipline is probably the biggest predictor of a kid's success long term in life, whatever you get into.
Agree. So that comes back, because, man, we could talk. I mean, there have been thousands of books written on this subject by people that, as many as I've read, have not had children. But when you think about it, it's like a kid. It's like, take my oldest granddaughter, Michaela. One day she was sitting there and we were having fun, and she took a whole drink of milk in her mouth, and I was sitting there, and she goes and splashed it, spit it, whatever you were, in my face. And she just laughed and giggled and laughed and giggled, and so did I. Mm-hmm. But she wasn't 17. She was about 2.
Yeah.
1 to 2.
Yeah. Well, I think you're hitting on an idea that's kind of been pitching around in my head for multiple years, and I'm still not sure exactly where I fit on it. But I think you can have good kids by having very strict discipline. But I think you only have great kids by discipline according to exactly what the kid needs. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying there is you could have stopped Michaela from spitting the milk and said no spitting milk, and she would have been a good kid. But by kind of showing her that there was nothing about the rules that made the rules great and all-powerful other than they were your rules, and you said sometimes spitting the milk is okay, which in a way kind of teaches kids that you almost have to teach kids to be disciplined and to push boundaries all at the same time, because people who are great are people who wind up being great in life are people who are able to butt up against those structures, those rules, and play inside the rules, do what's good to other people, take care of other people, but to break the rules when they needed to be broke.
Yeah. Sometimes I see people that believe that discipline somehow is more important than the child, mm-hmm. and so I've always opted off to this term. It is important to break every child's will, mm-hmm. but not their spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's both extremes. I think in our day and age, the majority of problems with discipline come from overindulgence because we're the indulgence generation. But also, I think there can be problems on the other end where it's discipline through fear, and there's a lot of problems with that because you're teaching compliance and not discipline. So discipline ultimately, at the end of the day, has to be generated internally. Or as soon as that force that forces you into compliance is gone, the discipline is also gone.
Yeah.
What do you do when nobody's watching?
Yeah.
Which comes down to not just enforcement of rules, but integration of morality, justice, integration of righteousness into your psyche and who you are as a person.
Well, I think it's always thought that the concept that was really good was you don't discipline your children so they will learn discipline. You discipline your children so they will know how to respect mm-hmm. themselves, God, and other people.
Yeah. And
that means it's an internal thing, not just a mental mind game of how much is 1 and 1 is 2.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you're talking earlier about where do you start with disciplining, and that kind of triggers, you said something kind of triggers something for me, is I think for me, discipline, especially in kind of those formative years when your kid's psyche their personality is developing, empathy and compassion and the golden rule are probably the most important thing to me. Mm-hmm. If you can, because I think you miss a window and kids learn selfishness and it becomes extremely difficult to unlearn selfishness. Mm-hmm. But I think if they have discipline and compassion, I think the course for life is so much better. I heard a psychologist explain it this way once, said if you don't discipline your kids, no adults will want to have meaningful interactions with your kids, and your kids will develop in a bad way because they don't have any meaningful interaction outside of themselves.
Outside of them, people like themselves. So
right.
the thuggies and the gangs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Great. That is truly, truly good. Well, I'm looking forward to your next blogs on the subject. Oh, and incidentally, the kid that looked out the window and saw the birds go by and all that did end up with a PhD in psychology. And so I'm very, very proud of him for that. But more than that, I'm proud of him because he loves God and he loves his children and his family, and he does a good job raising them. Thank you, everybody.
Hey y'all, thanks for joining us for Around the Supper Table. At Sanctuary Family Farms, we want to be real. Whether that's through our blogs, daily verses, or even Nana's recipes, we want to share the messages that God has laid on each of our hearts. If you liked what you heard today or want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook and YouTube at Sanctuary Family Farms or our website at www.sanctuaryfamilyfarms.com. where we share our recipes and blogs and sell farm fresh beef and pork. We can't wait for you to join us again for next week's episode.